We now have another guest. We're very lucky to be joined by staff writer for the American Prospect Alex Sammon. Welcome to the coverage.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you here, and we're ready to dive into the topic of money, where it's coming from, how it's affecting these races. I know you've been writing a lot about that recently. Talk to me a little bit about some of the big X factor in some of these races we're covering.
Yeah, well, the biggest player in Democratic primaries this cycle has turned out to be AIPAC, which is obviously the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. It's a pro-Israel group. It's actually hard to figure out how to describe it in a lot of ways. It's a conservative, pro-Israel group, one that until this cycle was at least self-identified as a bipartisan group. They didn't make any formal endorsements in races, and they surely didn't contribute significant money via super PAC and independent expenditure campaigns. And in this cycle, they've become the single biggest player in Democratic politics, and they spent, I think, $25 million now in Democratic primaries, and it's just an astonishing amount of money. And so we're seeing some of that on display tonight. There's some races that I think are where they played a crucial role in kind of determining the outcome.
Yeah, I know they've had that effect in some of the races that have already come, and I know tonight we've got a couple of races where they've spent literally millions of dollars. But before we dive into those individual ones, I just want to grapple with how and why. Why is it all of a sudden in this cycle that it's become so big? Is it that they're, I don't know, like, have they found new sources for the fundraising? Is there a perception that the stakes are higher and thus some sort of baked in prohibition against, like, almost single-handedly determine these outcome of the races has shifted? Why is everything so different from just 2 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think the big thing is they see an opportunity, and the opportunity is it comes from many different areas. But the one thing is there are a lot of retirements this year. Obviously, the Democratic caucus is very old, so there are a lot of members who are leaving, and so there are a lot of vacancies, and that with redistricting, kind of set the table for a lot of change in the caucus. And so AIPAC, I think, saw an opportunity that they could really shape the contours of this caucus going forwards, and because of the way gerrymandering has worked, there are not that many competitive Democratic on Republican races anymore. I mean, that's just not really the dynamic in this country. But there are a lot of up for grabs Democratic primaries where the outcome can be very different depending on whether or not a sort of left progressive candidate wins or a right wing corporate Democrat wins. And so AIPAC has raised an incredible amount of money, largely from Republican donors, billionaires and mega donors of the Trump campaign, realizing that it can really change the composition of the Democratic caucus if they get involved in these races, and that's what they've done. They've basically taken these $1 million checks from Republican donors, they plowed that money straight into Democratic primaries, and in really safe blue seats, they've really upended the process and made the caucus, I think, much more conservative already.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just disgusting following how much money AIPAC and the pro-Israel Pact are pouring into our elections, because these are people with foreign interests in mind, totally legal that they can throw money at these elections. I'm curious to know, you seem to describe this as more of a pull, right? They see an opportunity, Republicans are donating to AIPAC, they see new seats that they can grab. I was kind of thinking about it as a push. I feel like more people are aware of the Palestinian struggle in the United States, and I was sort of categorizing it as this anxiety. But do you think it's both? But you definitely think it's more of an opportunity?
I think it's both. I think it's a really good point. I will say that the last year and a half, we've actually seen the conversation on Israel really evolve, and there are certain things that were just not part of the discourse on Israel-Palestine even 18 months ago that have entered that. Obviously, I think unconditional aid to Israel has gotten very unpopular, especially with in Democratic districts and Democratic regions of the country. And so AIPAC, I think, knows that they're losing ground on some of these policy proposals and on public opinion. And so what makes that a really good point to raise is that, when AIPAC is advertising for these candidates, when they're pouring money into these ad spends and these TV buys, they're not talking about unconditional aid for Israel. They're not talking about the policies they support. They're talking about totally irrelevant stuff. They're in a lot of these races, Israel barely comes up, and so they know. I think that there's this sense that they're losing ground on the public opinion front, and they have to do something to protect that. And so I think you're right. I think it's both, and it's one of these things where both an opportunity to make the politics generally more conservative, but also they need to protect. I think they probably perceive that they need to protect their position in Congress at a time when they're really losing standing in the eyes of a lot of Americans.
You pointed out that one of the big sources of funding in this particular cycle is literal Trump donors, these billionaires funneling just huge sums of money, which we legally allow for some reason that I'll never understand. What does Democratic leadership think about this? Have they, I mean, it seems like the interests are somewhat intertwined in a lot of these races. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe you know of somewhere where it wasn't so much. Have they weighed in at all on how influential this has been?
They haven't, and it's a really interesting point. There was a race in Maryland that I think really put a fine point on this, where Donna Edwards, who was a close ally of Democratic leadership, was up against Glenn Ivey in a House seat in Maryland. It was an open seat. Glenn Ivey got millions of dollars of support from AIPAC, from their super PAC, and they came hard after Donna Edwards. Now one would think that at a certain point, maybe this would go too far, that finally Democratic leadership would say, all right, we're fine with the caucus getting more conservative, but we protect our friends. I mean, we know this is how the party leadership operates. They value personal relationships very highly. And they were pretty mute on the issue. I mean, Nancy Pelosi said at one point that one of the ads that was clearly misleading that AIPAC had put on the air was misleading, but didn't condemn the amount of money, didn't condemn the involvement, and really held her tongue on the issue. And so I think that's been part of it too, that AIPAC, I think, probably wanted to see how far they could go without running afoul of leadership. And no one's willing to condemn this at the high levels of the party. So as long as they can, sort of have the tacit encouragement, or they've avoided the open condemnation, they don't see any reason to stop doing it. And that race in particular, I think, really illustrated that point.
And I wanted to, press on with that, because you said, in light of them not really having much incentive to stop doing it. From what I was reading, I think one of the races, 6 million was the most that they had put in, and then for the United Democracy Project, like the average was like between 2 to 3 million per race that they put in, where they saw positive results. So like, just kind of like, I wanted to, to ask you more about like just the formula. Is that kind of like what we're seeing? Like they're going to put between $2 to $3 million in each of these races, and also just given like, the Supreme Court, they recently made it easier to corrupt incumbents and things like that. As the amount of money, like small dollar donations that progressives can give to races, or anybody really can give to races, as that number continues to rise up, and there's no real incentive for, organizations like AIPAC to stop giving, is there really a way that you see to close that gap to where we ever really can compete with how much money they give? And if not, how do we really change the tide in terms of just getting people to the polls, even though we may not be able to compete with them financially?
Yeah, I'll try to hit your first point first, and then the second point. I think those are both good questions. In terms of the formula, that's kind of what we've seen. It's it's something that actually has only really been part of this political process for a couple months now. But based on that short timeline, we've seen between 2 and 3 million has been pretty standard. I mean, not that long ago, 2 years ago, it would have been pretty extreme to see any super PAC funding in a House primary. I mean, that's those are the sorts of things you see in a presidential race, or maybe in a Senate race. Here we have it in these very small races, and that's why we're breaking the fundraising records or the cost for these races are breaking records all over the country constantly. And $3 million goes a long way. And in the say it's like a North Carolina's first district, for example. I mean, you can buy a lot of ad space for $3 million. So they've $6 million, or was the highest that they've gotten in a race so far. But we're looking at $25 million already, and it probably will get close to 30 by the time it's all said and done. And those are numbers we just haven't seen in elections like this. Like it's a really astounding development just in terms of the dollar spend. And then on the other side, how do progressives compete with this? It's tough because money in politics, the pendulum has really swung lately, and even 2 or 4 years ago, it was very common, even for more conservative Democrats, to say, I won't take corporate PAC money, I won't take super PAC spending. That was a toxic thing to be affiliated with, and the rise of the small dollar donation was a really influential part of kind of changing the discussion on politics and campaign funding. And now we've seen the pendulum kind of swing back the other direction now, where people are accepting super PAC money like it's nothing. It's very uncommon to hear like a moderate swear off corporate PAC money anymore. And that's a really, I think, alarming development for progressives. I don't know that I have a quick solution to that, but the interesting thing is that even the democratic process reforms that HR 1 that were on the table earlier in this this congressional or in this legislative year, those would have really curtailed some of this spending. I mean, those could have really changed or preempted some of what we've seen this cycle. So, it's not inconceivable that we could see this swing back. It's not inconceivable we could see legislation that would change this. And it was, not long ago where it looked like it was going to be very different. If HR 1 had passed, or even the Joe Manchin version of that had passed, we would not have seen these numbers this high. We wouldn't have seen this much super PAC involvement. And it's tough. It's tough for progressives now. I mean, I think the small dollar donation is a really important part of this, and you just have to raise more money now, and that's tough. Obviously, when you're raising it at $17 or $25 a pop. So it's a difficult development. It's one that I think is discouraging for progressives in a lot of ways, and it has forced some progressive groups to say, we need super PACs now. We have to compete in this arena now, and that's something that we weren't really hearing not even very long ago.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that just real quick, I'm sure that also we'll see a lot of innovation and just people getting more creative in light of that, because there's no incentive for them to stop donating money. So we'll just have to look at a lot more innovation. So
yeah.
Right, that's the sort of thing that even just making it toxic to accept money from super PAC like AIPACs United Democracy Project, that sort of thing is something that can be done. I mean, I think that the story isn't even really out there all the way, so that people know that this is money directly from Republican donors straight into Democratic primaries. And so there are definitely ways to compete, and then I think getting that message out there is a big part of it. But we haven't even seen much of that because it's such a new development.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna keep talking about it. You're doing a lot of great work in publicizing this, and we appreciate that, and you taking the time out to join us on our coverage. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.